Well, welcome, and thank you all for coming for the next lecture series of design fiction. We're carrying on from last year, but building up with a new subject matter completely. Presentations and discussions about design. But I want to thank a few people, because this has been a really kind of crazy rush together lecture series that we've done very quickly at the last minute. So I really want to thank Oliver for huge support, and the Design Institute for kind of helping us get all the material together and supporting it. And the graphic designers who did a great job on the poster and everything. But also David Benqué, who's going to be speaking, our first speaker. He's representing Studiolab RCA, which are part of a kind of an EU research group who are looking into synthetic biology and crossing these boundaries between design and science and what's going on there. So it's really great that he's here, and he's the first of our speakers. But also, you know, I really wanted to make this series different from the others, and I wanted to make it local, and I wanted to connect in with the local groups of people who are already doing stuff in Vienna, from Biofaction, and Gunther's here, who'll be speaking on next week, who've been already involved with, you know, DIY bio, and there's so much activity already happening in Vienna, so I really wanted this to link into that. So, and also to my staff for helping kind of bring this together. So, I mean, this event really is about bringing all these different communities together in the same space, and trying to exchange ideas and coming from very different viewpoints. And I think the sciences and arts have obviously been talking together for, I think, they've been talking a lot for a long period already. And in some ways, it's the design community of kind of the new kids on the block who are sort of joining in this debate. Is that not working? And in some ways, I want to, you know, think about, well, why should designers be interested in this stuff anyway? Bacteria, microbial stuff, we can't even see it. And designers are, you know, used to be working with their hands and developing things that are very tactile and sensual. You know, why is it should be of interest to them? And I think in many ways, I'm hoping that this lecture series will help reveal some of those things to everyone. Because I think materialization sits at the heart of what we do, and I think it's what we can contribute to this debate as we go. So I think some of the questions are, you know, what happens when the science starts to move out from the laboratory into everyday life? How do we start to think about it and deal with it differently? I think why should many of the investigations that are going on in science research labs stay within the lab, stay within the science field? You know, how can we make them sort of broader and enable more communities, more imaginations to work in the space for cultural expression as well? So you know, and then the question is, well, isn't that sort of a bit dangerous, having people who are not, you know, experts thinking about things they know nothing about? You know, should people be involved in those discussions if, you know, they really don't really understand the science at all? So that may be something that we could discuss. And I think there are many, many ethical questions when you start to look at the idea of engineering nature and what that means. And hopefully we'll bring that up in the discussion. So the format is that each speaker speaks for about 35 minutes. We might have a chance to have one question as a swap over. And then what we do is we sit down for a further 15 minutes and have some questions and discussion between the two speakers, and then we'll open it up to the audience if you can there are questions you're dying to ask, and then you can have them then. So I'm going to start with David Benqué. He'll be our first speaker. So he's a designer and researcher based at the Royal College of Art, running and teaching and running the research program there. He's been exhibiting in various venues: National Museum of China in Beijing, Glitch Fiction in Paris, Design Week, St. Etienne, and Z33. So I won't say any more, and I'll introduce David. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. As Fiona said, I'm a research associate at the Royal College of Art, and I'm leading a research program there called Studiolab, which I'll be telling you about today. I'm a designer and researcher in the sense that I'm interested in the impact of science on society and on culture. And in the past few years, this has been mainly about the impact of biology in those spheres. So I'm going to quickly introduce the project that got me interested in this space, which was called Acoustic Botany. And this was my MA project in 2010 at the RCA. And this was about a world where we engineer plants genetically to make music. So the interest in this project for me was to move from a very rational way of talking about these new advances in science and technology, which are always kind of justified in terms of basic human needs. So biotechnology is most often about feeding the world, fueling the world, and healing. But there is a whole spectrum of cultural reasons and aesthetic reasons where we've been modifying nature for centuries and millennia, which has nothing to do with human needs. It's all about desires and beauty and culture. So I set out to kind of investigate this fictional and quite fantastical scenario to, in a way, kind of look at existing practices such as the cut flower industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry which only caters to basically cultural objects of cultural meaning, flowers. So the project basically involved a collaboration with scientists at Harvard University and Imperial College in London. And so with the help of these biologists, I was able to kind of construct semi-real scenario of how these things would work. So it's basically relying on parasitical galls, which infect the leaves of plants and build up a gas supply, which reaches a certain pressure and then expresses a certain protein, which opens the little stoma that are on the leaf and creates these sound, much as in the same way that you would create sound from blowing into a balloon and then letting the air out through a very tight, kind of pressured hole. And so the idea was to, again, to kind of emphasize the man-made aspects. So part of the scenario is showing how scientists would fine-tune these things in the lab, playing with things like temperature and pressure to get the desired aesthetic sound. Another aspect of the project was looking more into symbiotic relationships where these nuts that have a fibrous, stringy pulp work together with insects that have jaws that are rigged to chew in rhythm, and together they kind of create these sounds at a certain season. And this process is actually part of the reproductive cycle of the plant, because eventually the little bugs cut through the fibers and the nut is allowed to fall on the ground and create a new tree, and so on. Another aspect of this was looking at grafting, where different frequencies of fruits could be grafted on the same tree and create harmonious kind of chords, if you like, just as in music. And so, again, this is a way through fiction to examine existing practices such as grafting, which are basically at the core of our modern version of agriculture. And interestingly, the moral boundaries around these things are very different. So we're completely okay with taking a knife and chopping a bit of a tree and sticking it into another one. Yet when we start operating at a kind of gene or molecular level, we start talking about playing God and that this is not okay. So it was a way for me to kind of investigate these things and hopefully trigger some of these questions in the audience. After this, I was able to develop this into an installation, which is kind of dark, but This is showing basically a whole garden made up of these species. And you could see the evolution of the sounds over a year, basically different seasons, things pollinating each other, starting to make sound at different times of the year, and also how an architecture of acoustic greenhouses would look like. So now I'm going to move on to the more current work, which is in the kind of framework of the Studiolab research grant, which includes partners all across Europe, places like the Science Gallery, Ars Electronica in Linz, Media Lab Prado, Le Laboratoire in Paris, and many others. And so we're all kind of coming together to investigate these relationships between art, design, and science. And so what we're focusing on within this is this kind of area of synthetic biology. And this title, which can seem a bit of a paradox at first or a contradiction, is actually reflecting the kind of tension we're looking at within that field. So on one hand, you have the kind of drive to engineer life, which is at the heart of synthetic biology. So this is the idea that you could create kind of a system of Lego blocks from biological parts that would then enable you to create your own kind of design systems that serve useful purposes. So this is really interesting in terms of our own view and our own relationship to life, where we're kind of, in a way, trying to describe these things that are very complex in engineering terms and very often actually in computer terms, and kind of asking the question, are we force-fitting something, the living, into our own vision of something that we're comfortable with, replicable and reliable systems, whereas actually the unknown plays a big part in this as life mutates, adapts to different contexts, and does so in what seems to be a pretty random way. Also, things don't live in a kind of vacuum, so the actions that you take on one level trickle down ecosystems as a cascade of kind of consequences. And this is the example of the floods in Pakistan forcing the spiders up the trees and coating these trees in their webs. And so this idea of the trophic cascade and that there is no, the consequences of each action are kind of completely out of control. And as Fiona mentioned, the unknown also refers to this idea of the science getting out of the lab and in the hands of people, which, you know, we don't have only neat and kind of happy thoughts. You know, we're complex beings with conflicting kind of interests and motivations. So this is the example of 3D printing, which is described as the next industrial revolution, yet people are already printing guns with it. So coming back to biology, as designers, or the main narrative is that these two things have a lot in common, so that we be able to basically make programming language for life. So we're investigating the tensions between these two things and how there may be differences and how these differences might be actually more interesting than trying to force the analogies. So as designers, this means that the biological world that we're supposedly entering, the definition of design within that world might change drastically. So it might change from design as a blueprint, as something that is exact, a sketch becomes a prototype, becomes a product, to design as an intention, as something that has to go through trial and error, that has to be constantly kind of monitored and dealt with, and that has literally kind of a life of its own. So through the project, we're looking at kind of different strands of interest. The first one is mutant products, so kind of placing these things within industrial context. So what happens when your product mutates from one generation to the next. What's the business plan for these things? How do you, patent something which again will be different in a month or 2 months from now, as soon as it kind of reproduces and does so on an industrial scale. The other interest is the kind of more domestic and DIY aspect, and what impact does the kind of gardener or hobbyist, what impact does he have on the grand scheme of evolution, and how do we deal with that? And I guess also looking at the idea that science is culture. And this third thing is looking more closely about, or at the analogies that are being made between, again, life and electronics. So down to the visual languages that are used to describe these things, you see that there are obvious, we're trying very hard to convince ourselves that these things are the same, but maybe this is an opportunity to consider the bug or the error as something else and something that might actually produce desirable outcomes, or help us to think of these things in different ways. So the practice is basically all the projects. There are 7 projects in total, but they all kind of sit within the spectrum between actually experimenting with the stuff of life and speculating and creating stories about what these things might do in the future. So we have Raphael Kim, who's actually a very hands-on DIY bio enthusiast and designer, who's playing with physical things. Someone like Kobe Bard, who kind of sits in between. He makes up stories, fictional stories, but all the technology that are featured in the stories actually exist. So he's kind of proposing alternative to the present uses of technologies. And then Tobias Revel is more of a kind of proper fictional character. He makes up future stories about technologies that don't exist yet. And so through this whole spectrum, we're hoping to kind of raise a variety of questions and to engage people in different ways, all the way from kind of opening up spaces for experiment and actual live experience to triggering the imagination and raising these questions through stories. So I'm going to talk to you about the project that I'm doing within that, which is currently a work in progress. So I'd be happy to discuss these things afterwards if anyone has thoughts. Basically, following on the Acoustic botany project, I kept a very strong interest in these debates, and more specifically about the debate about GMOs and the kind of very polarized positions that this topic generates. So it's very much about, you're either for or you're against, and the people don't tend to have, there are people with nuanced positions, but it's the people on the extremes kind of speak so loud that it's hard to get the nuance in the middle. So things like the recent campaign for labeling GMOs in California, Prop 37, which was, called, was basically an attack on the agricultural industry, but a lot of people call them kind of anti-science or, bad science, etc., all the way to calling them the equivalent of the climate skeptics in the left-wing kind of climate skeptics. So the main characters in this, or some characters in this, are on the one hand José Bové, the French activist who's known to have pulled out crops and sometimes research crops, as opposed to Mark Linus, who's an English activist who used to be against this stuff and recently kind of turned around and said, you know what, actually this stuff is good and I'm really sorry that I pulled out all your crops and we should be doing this stuff. So kind of zooming out from these very kind of detailed and polarized debates, I got very interested in this idea of environmentalism and how different positions are emerging at the moment. So zooming out, there's basically, I mean, this is very, in a way, very simplistic. Alternatives exist, but it's just for the sake of kind of debate. With regards to the environment and technology, there are basically two main positions. On one hand, you have the bioconservatives, which are going with this kind of romantic idea of nature and basically advocating limits on our technological progress and saying that, you know, it might be better to go back because every kind of advance creates new problems. And on the other hand, you have the techno-progressives, which are all about solving the problems with more technology. So, you know, the climate is warming, so we're going to send giant mirrors in space and reflect the sunlight, so, you know, we're just going to cure it. And this kind of plays nicely with this ecosystem kind of cascade that I was talking about earlier. With like, it's like an endless kind of chasing our own tail, and a very utopian vision of technology, which the kind of climax point of this is the transhumanist or singularity vision of that we're all going to be able to download our minds to computers and live forever, basically. So we're looking at these two kind of extremes. I got interested in a number of factors which kind of point to a third way, which is maybe a bit more nuanced, but also maybe more interesting. So the combination of this growing DIY bio movement, citizen science, and putting biotech into the hands of everyone. The drive and the campaign for the open access to scientific research. Recently, with the death of Aaron Swartz, a famous activist who was in the process of being prosecuted for liberating a whole lot of scientific journal databases. The rise of highly efficient networks of activists who are operating in a kind of headless, cell-based way, and are having a huge impact, at least on the media. So things like Anonymous and a lot of different similar movements. So combining all these things kind of points to a kind of third way in between the techno-conservatives and the techno-progressives and the bioconservatives that is embracing science, but maybe for kind of more citizen and kind of ideal-based purposes. So a few stories which are the kind of core of this project and inspirations for it. One is the Weather Underground. So this is a group of students during the civil rights movement in America who basically started retaliating for injustice and campaigning for civil rights by basically placing bombs in buildings, but they would always warn the authorities in advance. So in the end, they had to go underground, hence their name, for over 10 years. And when they finally came out, it turned out that the FBI had used such dirty methods to try and infiltrate them that very few of them went sent to jail. Because also at this 10 years later, with this distance, it was kind of obvious then that the kind of thin line between terrorism and kind of activism was now shifted to the other side, and so everyone could see that there were kind of rights back then, and so it's this line that I'm interested in with the project. The second thing is this story that you might have seen where this rogue geoengineer dumped a lot of iron sulfates in the ocean to create an algal bloom, which is basically like a way to trap CO2, one of the methods that are currently being studied. But he actually went ahead and did it on his own. And so this kind of points to this idea that more and more kind of lone operators are going to be able to do these things that have a global impact. And actually this was a sketch that I had in the beginning of the project, and it actually turned up in the paper a few months later, so you see these like line between fiction and reality kind of blurring. And the last thing is this story of the cocaine farmers in Colombia. So basically the war on drugs means that the American planes spray Roundup, which is a herbicide, over the hills where the coca is growing. And they started noticing that some of the plants were becoming resistant to it. And so Joshua Davis, this journalist for Wired magazine, went to investigate whether the farmers themselves did this in the kind of traditional breeding way. So they found one plant that was surviving and then kind of crossbred that and kind of started passing it on, or whether it was the drug cartels kind of forcing scientists to insert the Roundup gene in the coca plant. I'll leave you to find out the answer, but this is a very interesting case of one gene basically turning the tables on the US Army, where in the end, when you have the coca, which is resistant to Roundup, these planes are basically doing the jobs of the farmers because they kill everything but the coca plant, so they basically are helping instead of destroying. This is 2004, so I think unfortunately since then there are new, much more nasty forms of herbicide that are being used. But it's still very interesting in this idea of like microscopic genes having a kind of bigger geopolitical impact and being kind of actors in this war. So going back to DIY bio and this kind of movement that I was starting to think about dealing with environmental issues and things like that, I became really interested in the kind of the image that this movement is constructing for itself, and the really incredible pressures that it's under. Basically, this is all within the context of the FBI listening on in every kind of biohacking conversation. DARPA, the research arm of the US Army, is starting to fund hacker spaces in which a lot of the biohack labs are set. And so this movement is really kind of with its back to the wall to be positive and happy and good, which is interesting. So zooming in on this part, you see that the only things that are okay are the kind of positive and safe. And coming back to the weather underground, it might be a bit small to see, but positive is also legal and negative is illegal. So I started asking myself the question whether, there might be some things that are illegal now, and historically, things that are illegal sometimes are still good. And, it's kind of this weird tension between the two. And we seem so stuck when it comes to the environment and this kind of doomsday scenario that we hear about all the time, that I started thinking that maybe some good illegal things were going to be necessary. So the project is basically about a fictional group of activists who kind of sit within this space of pro-science yet green ideology. And so they operate within, or according to this kind of extreme manifesto, which is the 5 main points are basically symbiosis as a kind of driving ideology. So parasitic behavior will not be tolerated, so this includes one-way fossil fuel extractions and things like that. The idea of an untouched nature is rejected, so there is nowhere to go back to, only forward. The rejection of the precautionary principle, the end of intellectual property and opening research for the people. And the last point is species galore, so this is the idea of we should be protecting all species and create as many new ones as possible. So I'm kind of investigating this through a set of kind of diagrams and sketches, and then there is also an installation in the works. So this is a kind of political positioning. And I'm very interested in this idea of the Overton window, which is basically a spectrum of acceptability of an idea. So this is used in politics. But the idea that by proposing something outrageous enough, you kind of push the initial thing that you wanted to actually push through in the range of the acceptable by comparison to the really outrageous thing that you're proposing. So this also kind of drives the project in the sense that some things are really outrageous, and then some things are kind of more sensible, and hopefully the outrageous ones will make the sensible but still new ones look acceptable. So I'm kind of starting to map out these relationships between nature, man, technology, and the kind of new stance that they're adopting, and then making some proposals like an implementation of the Creative Commons terms in DNA kind of cassettes or systems that you could implement. So something like share alike would mean that if a plant is set not to produce seeds, then it wouldn't grow at all. If something is not, well, the attribution is kind of, you could always embed the name as an encoded kind of sequence of letters like it's being done now. But also things like controlling the number of generations after which you wouldn't be allowed to grow something anymore, or something like that. Some of the slightly crazier stuff is using the anemone as a kind of tactical analogy, where activists could coat themselves in an antidote so that a toxin could be used and only affect the authorities. So kind of using the clownfish as a kind of black bloc tactic. And then investigating some of the things as models as well. So this is an idea. So these models, the idea with them is that they're kind of test rigs, so kind of little home experiments, but they reflect much bigger ambitions of this group, which is potentially or wants to have consequences on a much bigger scale. So here they're testing the microbial infection of diesel fuel tanks. This is something that actually exists, but would be kind of optimized and spread throughout kind of fuel distribution systems. The other idea is to finally shift public opinion on palm oil by modifying it genetically with lipase inhibitors. So it's basically, this means that you wouldn't be able to digest anything that has palm oil in it. So basically you get diarrhea every time you eat palm oil. So obviously this is like a shift of public opinion that they would have to make for themselves. And the last thing is to look at the kind of troposphere, where research has shown recently that a lot of microbial colonies actually thrive. The troposphere is the kind of lower atmosphere where planes fly, so that modified bacteria could live up there and potentially encourage the corrosion of planes and so on. So this is all I have for now, and I'm looking forward to discussing this.
Yeah, we'll move straight on to Sonja. Let me introduce her. So actually, I didn't mention that David was actually started life from within graphic design. He was commenting on all the leaflets, saying, that smells like what I remember. So, and what's interesting as well is Sonja's coming from a fashion design background, so from very, very different places that they're both exploring, this very, very different world. And so Sonja actually studied fashion design at the Fashion Institute here in Vienna, and she then did a master's in conceptual design in Eindhoven Academy in Eindhoven. And she was awarded just recently the Outstanding Artist Award for Experimental Design, which was a project about textile anatomy. So again, she's exhibited all over the place, in New York, in Netherlands, in Italy, in Belgium, and has some of her work, her textiles work, within the Textile Museum in Tilburg in the Netherlands, part of the National Collection. So I'd like to introduce Sonja. Thank you.
So, hello everybody. I have to put. It's nice to be here and to show my work or introduce my work to you. So, I'm going to show you actually some project samples, especially focusing on the process, and one film. So, I'm going to start the whole presentation with actually my fascination for the human body. So I'm actually, in my projects I mediate between my background, which is fashion and design, and the interest with scientists. So since 4 years I'm collaborating with different universities. And I'm exploring the human skin and its potential, and how we could actually use this hidden platform on our skin in new, unexpected ways. So I'm really intrigued by the fact that we carry 2 to 3 kilograms of bacteria on us, and that when we think, or as we think normally about our human body as a unit, it's actually not a unit. It's like really the human body is expanding into space constantly and invisibly. So I'm very interested in this exchange. So the human skin is actually not really a limit. It's like, the bacteria expand into this space and blurring this kind of border. So actually, this whole interest, or you can say the interest in the human body, reflections about fashion, and my interest in biology, they linked together during my last year of my thesis at the Design Academy Eindhoven, which was called Invisible Membrane, Life on the Human Body and its Design Application. And there I was very interested if we can find new ways, or the main research question was if we actually could use the small creatures which live on our skin and create a new living system on our skin, and how this would also change the interaction between humans and the environment. And I was reflecting a lot also about our existing second skin, in the sense of that clothing, actually since 1,000 years, over 1,000 years, you could say the function of clothing stayed the same. So we actually use clothing for camouflage, for protection, and for decoration. So I was wondering if we could explore the second skin in new ways. So in the first step, actually, I was focusing on the function. So actually, could we use bacterial population which communicate with the body needs. So I made these pictures of my body by 10 and 20 degrees. So actually this project is a development of 10 degrees outside temperature. And I looked at the different body zones, and it's absolutely, it's a visualization of this scientific data of temperature, because at that point I didn't know about bacteria. It was really the imaginary first part. So I was imagining my fingers are in the front cold, so for instance, could the bacteria communicate actually, please build the material up here and open on another part, so it would not be anymore one surface, but it would actually be an open system. And it was very interesting in this, it's actually, the project exists of 7 hand crocheted pieces. So the outcome was for me very fascinating, because it shows a fundamental change in the aesthetic of clothing. Because usually in a conventional production of clothing, you focus very much on the item's shape when you think about function. So you actually start with a cut, and then you look how to transform the cut, or you always start from the cut of a trouser and develop from that something. So a trouser is defined as a trouser, a t-shirt is defined as a t-shirt. So here actually the starting point is not relating to proven historical forms, but it's related to the needs of a human body at 10 degrees outside temperature. So yeah, after this step, I wanted to know more, and I started actually to interview scientists, and wanted to find out more about generally how bacteria grow, how they behave, and how this idea could work. So I started actually interviewing a scientist from the Utrecht University in the Netherlands. It was the first scientist I was confronting with this hypothesis, and he was very open to my talk, because actually he was working since 30 years with bacteria which cause diseases. And the interesting part was, after a talk, he looked at me and he said, it's interesting, he never thought about bacteria in such a positive way, and that I really, that he will look up for further literature in this direction. So something, that was the first sign for me, the small sign to, okay, something is opening up here, I need to go on there. And actually, my way brought me to the Wageningen University, and it was and it still is, or I feel in these situations kind of a child entering a new world, the scientific community. So actually, it's very exciting, because you need to formulate a new aesthetic but also verbal communication. And that was a very exciting part for me, because you start actually from zero. You have a very simple question, but that's actually the exciting part, because you question things which are very defined by the scientific community, or taken for granted also. So yeah, my way brought me to Wageningen. So I did an internship with microbiologists, not to become a scientist, but to understand the tools, the scientific tools, how to know more about the material I wanted to work with. And yeah, during this time I could really experience how inspiring this exchange is on both sides, like from scientists and the collaborations in between them, because I really think that the science, or I could actually recognize that scientists are very often really focused on the microcosmos, and that an artistic point of view is more, how can I say, it's like, artists prefer actually to work interdisciplinary on projects. So it's really an input, so they can actually recognize relations more easily. So I really think that the science needs this imagination part in order to have this fiction and to question existing definitions and to bring this scientific information out of the lab. So at the next step, after I got the first petri dishes from the lab, I started to map my body, and I made this number system from 1 to 20 in order to document and look like which bacteria grow on which part, and documented the whole outcome. So this is, for instance, a bacteria from my right shoulder, a bacterial population, sorry. And these are kind of, yeah, you could say micro self-portraits. And actually it's really, yeah, I always did, and I always do the experiments on my own body, not generally because I think it's a special one, but because I have it always with me, and also I like really to find out about myself and yeah, explore it, what is actually there, what lives there. So then the next step, I kind of wanted to find out even more. So I wanted to go away from a 7 centimeter petri dish, and I wanted to visualize a bigger part of my body. So that I called oversized petri dish. And it was a challenge for the lab as well as for me, because a petri dish in that size was in that lab not made before. So it was a challenge of finding the right materials. So yeah, anyway, I brought this back from Wageningen to Eindhoven, and actually really pleased my flatmates with this growing stinking petri dish growing in the living room. With a lot of contamination happened, so a lot of fungus was actually growing there. And I looked at that, I documented it from day 0 to day 44. And for me it was so impressive, or that was really mind-blowing during the process, that actually a part of my body is growing independently from the living organism there. And I can actually observe this. So somehow this, yeah, that we are actually not aware of this yeah, invisibility. I was, yeah, it was mentally in the whole process step a very, very important point. So, which is actually interesting, because bacteria, they digest our vitamins, and they educate our immune system to keep illness-causing bacteria out. So the question is, yeah, when did we actually define bacteria as something bad? Of course, they can cause diseases, as we all know, but yeah, when it's actually interesting, the fact that yeah, in nature existing bacteria actually, the most in nature existing bacteria are actually positive. So I wanted to visualize that on a 3D form. So I made this model of my hand. And there the bacteria didn't grow, but still I wanted to show this work in exhibition, because it was also a very exciting experience for me, that actually, yeah, you can make 100 experiments, but you don't know if they're going to grow, because it's living material. That's also the magic, that you actually work with a living material which you cannot control, which is actually, yeah, which is the exciting part on it. Yeah, and further research like showed me more and more that we are actually a walking biotope, that we are a hybrid, that we are an ecosystem. Like when you focus on, especially on the genes, as you can see here. Like actually, during my process, I was very surprised generally that we know 2 to 3%. That's the percentage from I know from 2 years ago, so I don't know actually exactly the percentage of now, but at that point, 2 years ago, you must imagine we know 2 to 3% of our skin bacteria, which was so surprising for me, that we actually looked like decades on different planets, but we actually don't have that much knowledge about our body. And then actually in 2000, the first human microbiome, like, or the genes of one human was sequenced, which actually thought that this would give us more answer who we actually are. But actually, yeah, it showed us that it's so complex and so amount that we actually know even less than we knew before. Because the genes that we have are 100 times more than bacterial genes mathematically are 100 times more than our own genes, like humans' genes. When we look at the cells, for instance, on one body cell they come 10 bacterial cells. So that was quite amazing for me to find out. So actually, when we think that we carry 2 to 3% of this bacteria on our body, one could pose the question like, who feeds whom? So after getting to all these scientific tools, also scientific research, I started my experiments with the second skin material which we have at the moment, like textile. So I was looking into natural textile, synthetic and mixed, and I was making experiments with 3 different persons' bacteria, and with different, giving them different structures, giving them different materials. And there was always made in the Petri dish fingerprint and they always grew around the fingerprint. Just on the left side you see the yellow one, the yellow lines. These are actually bacteria which organize themselves around the fibers, which for sure has to do with surface tension. But what that means exactly, we don't know. So I really strongly believe also in this experience from the last years that this symbiosis of art, design and science is very, very important because a lot of scientific information is only discussed by the scientific community. So I think it's very important that this information goes out in the public and stimulates discussion about these new developments. So then I developed this project which is called Visible Membrane Number 1. And on the right side you see a picture from the Renaissance, so actually discovering the inside of the body and the organs, and I was inspired by that and translated it in the visible membrane on the left side. And I knitted around this mannequin, so again to speak kind of a language in between fashion and science. And then cut the wool in the front, and you see this brownish is actually a petri dish with the bacteria. So I used the wool which showed the best experiments until now. And it wants to say that perhaps we should have another look on our skin and look what's there and what the potential of this invisible existing infrastructure could be. And then so all these steps were actually my thesis project, and I wanted to sum it up in a film. And I'm going to show you this film. It was actually the first film I ever made with no budget, but with a lot of support of my friends. And it's actually won 2 years ago at the Biofiction a prize for the category fiction, which I was really happy about. Oops.
Invisible. On our skin can be found a second invisible skin. This secretive second layer of skin is full of life and serves as a membrane for exchange. The human body does not end with its skin, but it is invisibly expanding into space through bacteria. Skin bacteria adapt individually to their host. Imagine a world in which clothes could breathe, grow and respond to the surrounding area. Clothes which live, not just keep us warm or cool. The invisible membrane would, for instance, react to the body temperature and to the local temperature via bacteria population's knowledge. During my research, I found this extraordinary organism which can change and adapt its shape depending on climatic conditions. Slime fungi are neither plants nor animals, but still living organisms. As slime fungi do not have cell walls, they are highly sensitive to chemical disturbances and react quickly. They are quick change artists. I think we can learn from them. Would we become more sensitive or attentive thanks to the changes in color, shape and structure of a flexible, visible membrane? Would social integration, for example, be possible faster via an aesthetic and functional adaptation to the environment? And what would this mean? The invisible membrane would not be firmly defined, but it would be an open living system on our skin, which would be able to react autonomously in a flexible way to the local requirements and to individuals. I want to create objects which are freed from the historical context, from the information about social hierarchy and material richness. The object shall tell a story about us as human beings, about our present perception, our fragility, our fears and pleasant sensations. The last imaginary layer are plants. I think they could give us visibility of, for instance, climate changes. They could lead us to new living material properties. My vision is to make use of the invisible body layer, our knowledge over the individual skin bacteria population, for the purpose of transforming it into a visible, functional and flexibly adapting membrane. I believe that this new clothing on our skin could change our interaction with the environment and have a healthy benefit for humans. I think our second skin should be guided by individual body needs, social needs, and individual beliefs and not by fashion.
So yeah, after I'm going to show you 3 more examples of my work. So after actually being away for years from Vienna, I came back in 2010 and I was searching for an exchange between art and science. And I found Mr. Schopf, Erich Schopf, which is actually a bacteriograph, how he calls himself. He has a collection of around 7,000 bacteria from all over the world, and he's making experiments with them since 1999. And yeah, I had a talk with him, and it's not that often that you meet somebody who shares the same passion for bacteria. So it was really great to, to talk, and we decided we need to do a project together in order to exchange our knowledge. And so yeah, we started the process of cartography of the human body, which is actually a mapping of the whole front part of the body. From one individuum on one specific day, we wanted to make, in one special location, we wanted to make a print on textile. So the experiments actually took us 8 months. So we were testing the bacteria, how dominant they are, because actually you need to apply the bacteria which are more weak first on the body before you make a print. And we counted them, we made a whole body mapping in order to really document where we found what, in which density. And we found, and that's the temporary skin flora, so actually the one which we collect during one day, we found 31 colors, most amazing, beautiful colors. And we actually reduced to 6 colors, 6 main. This was more like technical reasons because of bacteria growth and the consistency on the textile from different bacteria. From bacteria. So actually we made all different kind of experiments. Also, how do you apply the bacteria then in order that how you want them to grow after on the textile. So it was a long process to find out. At the end it was the density. So it's really the point, in the density you apply them, that's how the picture will grow. So here are some in-between experiments. And that's actually the outcome, which was on six textile pieces. 6 pieces from a very actually practical point of view, because you have to make all these things sterile. So you need, the whole performance takes place in a lab, so in a sterile room. So actually I remove my existing skin bacteria flora and then replace in, it takes about 4 to 5 hours to really prepare this invisible color, and then it's applied on my body in the right order, and then I make this print. And after they grow, we decide when to stop the bacterial growth in order that all colors are grown actually. And I was actually a bit, I wanted to translate this information also in another project, because I thought the complexity of the scientific information needs to come out even more. And at that point I got a commission from a museum in the Netherlands, and I translated this in a hand-crocheted and hand-knitted silhouette from the front. The only difference is here that this semi-transparent represents the layer in between the individuum and the environment, and the colorful interpretations are the bacteria, and here I also included actually the fungus. So, and of course I blow it up in a macro perspective and focused on actually 20 different body parts. And then I had the luck to meet Alfred Wendel, who was making actually a film about the membrane around the body, and in 3D. He was filming it in 3D, a scientific documentary for Servus TV Terra Mater. So it was a film called Wir sind Planeten, so our planets. And I made this project especially conceptualized for this film. So, and at that point I was like, okay, I want to make a really big petri dish, like for the whole body. I want to present them living. So actually we filmed the growing landscape with 3D. So the petri dish was 2.20 meters by 70, and we used 4 liters of agar. And this project was, it was a challenge in the sense that I had a lot of sleepless nights before, because I was praying that the bacteria grow, because when the whole film team comes and then the silhouette is not there, and luckily they grew. They wanted to grow, not all the colors, but 2 of them, so And it was also a very big challenge, because I needed actually to get naked in front of a film team, which was a very new experience for me. And I was lying, last year in January in this petri dish, very cold, and I had to laugh so much, because I was thinking, Sonja, what are you actually doing here? So then that crack happened. So I think it's a very nice crack, and I also like to show this part of the process in the final outcome, because it has the same value. So generally, like I could say that in my work that I created for me this limitless kind of platform where I allow myself to explore everything I like to explore, and of course also I showed you all these experiences I had with scientists, and with a main goal, the goal to really communicate these informations, these scientific informations, in order that the public gets to know about it and can reflect on it and comment on it. And generally in the sense of the ecosystem, or the symbiotic ecosystem that we are, I think that we should stop being disgusted, or we should start being amazed, I think. So thank you very much for your attention.
Two very, very fascinating and stimulating presentations. I was struck very much with, actually it's very nice the end point that you finished with, the ecosystem. It came up you know, a lot about the person, the human within the greater ecosystem, from the scale of the, you know, the activists taking part to the very kind of tactile and immediate perception of how we saw the body. Were there any, do you have any kind of comments about each other's work, or thoughts about those different scales, or from the different approaches that you're taking? Because also you're taking very, very different approaches to how you're doing work, where Sonja, you're working very closely, you know, with scientists in the laboratory, and I know, David, that you have been involved working very closely with scientists also to look at your work too.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think, does it work? Yeah? No? I take this. Okay. So I think that that our work is actually very close in the sense of the goal or the aim, that we actually both want to translate these new scientific achievements in order to be a medium to the public. So I guess that's the same, and I would say the methodology is very different, but the aim is the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree, but I think I was thinking, knowing when you mentioned that we both have a design background, and I was actually very curious to hear your thoughts on what you think our place is in the world as designers. Or, I don't know, first of all, do you call yourself a designer or an artist? And also, I think maybe even beyond this, the role of like just being an interface between the lab and the public, there may be a real value in what we do. I recently was reading through this grant application, and they actually said, in this case, creatives are considered researchers. And this was a very new thing. I was very happy about it. But then, you know, of course, then afterwards you have to prove your track record of peer-reviewed papers, which, you know, we don't have as creatives. And so these kind of tensions, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it.
So actually, to the first question, I would say, as I want to introduce myself, that my project's mediate. So it's really mediates between fashion and science, design and science. And for me, I have always these periods where I think very often, like, do I need to have this definition? And I find out for myself that it's really, like, for me, an absolute border in the sense of define. And actually, I don't see myself as a product designer. I don't see myself as a fashion designer, like in the 100% of definition, how we define it. So I would say I'm something in between. I don't know, actually.
What do you think that you bring to the space that, you know, what questions do you think you ask that you find that are not being asked within the collaborations that you're working with? Are there things that are surprising you that don't seem to surprise your collaborators, or ways in which you're thinking about seeing the model of things that are very different? You know, do you get very strange reactions from your collaborators?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, also what I said with my thesis, like at that time, I mean, I asked this question if you could use this bacteria in our skin, and at that time in the Design Academy, being in a design department, it was very weird to get this question, because most of the time the product at the end was a classical product, but to really work with that, I really had to fight for this belief, for this idea, or for myself. Yeah, you could say.
Well, I think for me, it's mainly about, well, obviously about the stories and kind of bringing up ideas that the scientists themselves wouldn't necessarily have about their own work, because they're very focused on, obviously, very technical and minute details, and so you kind of maybe bring a more complex picture of how this thing, you know, we've said that a lot, how things get out of the lab. And I guess I'm kind of noticing it with the difference between the plant project which was very poetic and kind of no problems at all. And now with the activist project, which is kind of more of a nudge in the ribs and kind of really maybe asking more critical questions, that has been more difficult. But still, well, I guess first of all, like trying to email people and then getting responses like, oh no, I must warn you, you should not do this, you shouldn't even suggest this, because I'm not actually planning on doing it, but you shouldn't even suggest this if you don't want to go to jail and stuff. But then, interestingly, so that person replied this, and then I replied saying that was really interesting already, and that maybe we could meet for a coffee off the record, and we agreed. And when we met for coffee, we completely agreed on most of the stuff. So I think it's kind of navigating these narratives that I'm really interested in, and the things that a scientist would tell you when you're having coffee with them, and the things that they're writing in their research grant applications, then I think that's the kind of space in between that I'm really interested in, and how, in the case of synthetic biology, which is a very kind of defined, or maybe not defined field, but the label itself is really hyped up at the moment, and so describing this as a kind of free-for-all, save the world kind of discipline, and of course you justify your funding with that, but actually maybe our role in this is to come in with a more critical and cultural background and have something to bring to that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just wanted to add also, like, the whole learning experience when you contact actually the scientist, and my first experience that you want to communicate something, and actually you're talking like 1 hour, but it's absolutely not coming like what you actually want to say, because it's such a completely different language. And then you develop actually your own tools, how to interact with them, so that you really come with visual materials and that they immediately understand what you want suddenly. So yeah, also the development of special tools for that.
So actually, in our own experience, this idea of creating a sort of an open space for professional people to imagine. So I'm picking up on what you were saying about with a creative, how to that experts and professionals can imagine is a really difficult thing, because being professional, you're not allowed to speculate, and you're not allowed to imagine the impossible, those edges. So I think how to create a space where it feels safe to imagine. And I guess in some ways your activist space doesn't feel very safe. I wouldn't say that was a design space that allows you to it does feel like it is a dangerous space that you're operating within. And you really are touching edges, whereas, I think as designers, we probably do that anyway through, obviously there's a naivete to the work that we do, but I think that in some ways, identifying what the safe space is and allowing people into that space to imagine is one thing that we could try and work out how to do, in that way. Is there any more you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of the safety of it, I think, what's interesting to me and with the last project we're currently working on is that it's not safe, in that it triggers people to think, maybe to make up new stories that are not necessarily that extreme, but they, that are alternative to the current kind of packages that are available on the shelf of like newspapers and things like that. There is some, I don't know, it's like this, I think the sciences also involve a lot of creativity, but it's like, if you take design and say biology, I think both the biologist and the designer are using their creativity a lot, but the scientists are not allowed to say that. So I'm sure they rely on hunches and intuition and things like that in the lab, but you know, we want sciences to be exact, so they're not allowed to talk about these things. Whereas we are encouraged to, you know, show our inspiration and our process and our poetics, where, you know, it's kind of this weird tension. But I think on both kind of sides of the fence, if there is a fence, there is, you know, the intuition and the creativity basically plays a big part, I think.
Yeah, I think what you just said also with the scientists actually with this intuition, I think also when they formed their research question, but then it goes really, when I was in Wageningen in the lab, it was really, there needed to come out the right kind of number, you know, everything else which could be actually an error and could lead to something which you are like, wow, exciting, actually this is not working the way it should work, and perhaps there is something, it was not, no, we don't want that, we want the correct numbers, kind of, yeah.
So can you tell me the role that storytelling in your work, how you use stories to develop your thinking more? And do you use stories? Because I think in some ways your stories are really different from each other. And how are they different? I mean, how do you use storytelling in your work?
Well, I'd say my work is almost only storytelling. But it's about, I guess, as a designer, using what we recognize as designed objects to create these kind of windows on different possibilities, if that makes any sense. I guess for me, the whole challenge is to imagine something which is different and engaging enough to draw the attention, is to trigger the imagination, but also then to ground this within a lot of existing things. And using, it's for me, during the research at least, the story is almost a lens through which I can look at things that, a lot of things that already exist. And then through that lens you kind of place this in a new context. So things like Anonymous, you know, have nothing to do with biology yet, but they played a big part in informing the kind of story that I want to tell with this project, because these are things that are happening, and these are, you know, fascinating kind of complex human behaviors. And so I guess it's a mix between this initial story that I set out to tell, but then using that almost as a research tool to look at existing things.
Yeah, I think for me the story itself evolves. It's for sure a big part in my work, but it's also, yeah, it's a story I build by myself by going in the process through the different steps, and by that actually creating their own story. Also, yeah, imagining, of course, this kind of future scenarios, which then at the end you need to find a story or a way to that. So I would also say that, yeah, it's a big part in my work.
And particularly, Sonja, with the materialization of the, you know, in many ways, the way that you're creating, like the plant idea of the way that manifests itself. How important is sort of the fact that you do make your own interpretations? How does that kind of work with? How does that feed back actually into some of the scientists, and what do they kind of think about what you've done to how they perceive their science to be?
You mean so the reaction of them to my work, yeah? Mm.
Some of the extreme examples of what you're translating.
Yeah, I would say actually, I mean, I have some examples where the reaction, very different reactions, but mainly very inspiring and very open to that. Like they really then search the kind of discussion of how it could work. So they're really open to imagine these futures, and it's very nice to conversate with them. Yeah, in my experience. Yeah. For you?
I don't know if that applies. Or you mean the material aspect of it? Yeah, yeah.
Why did you make models of your final project?
Oh, good Good question. Well, some of the models are printed and some of the models are like physical. And I don't know if that changes the relationship with the scientist. I think at that point the scientist is part of the audience. So it's, for me, the same kind of purpose is to create this kind of storytelling medium, which isn't a feature film, it's not a science fiction book, it's not a comic book or it's kind of finding new languages to make these stories exist in kind of tangible and like, I guess, engaging ways. So the audience can have a relationship with them and kind of, I guess aesthetics in the end plays a part as well, because it's that which gets us in, gets an audience drawn in, and then there is a whole lot of kind of research and scientific detail that then you may or may not want to go that far, but there is kind of different levels, and the first level is aesthetics and getting, kind of imagining things from physical objects, I guess.
Just want to add here something also, because for instance the crocheted membrane, it was really important to visualize that in the sense of that it's also something touchable, and it's textile and it's hand crocheted, but it's actually communicating scientific information in a very handcraft, like in a material which we are very used to. And I think that was especially for a lot of people in the exhibition. I could see one of the most reaction to this, because it's something you can touch and you can take the people from there and bring them to the future. Yeah.
So I think they both kind of deal with everyday worlds and help us to sort of bridge those gaps between things that are very, very abstract. I love to see your diagrams, David, or the abstract science which we just can't understand, and then to bring them into these very, very tactile connections. And but I guess my question is also about how much do you think is still carried through of the detail of the factual side of the science that still remains there. But maybe it's 8 o'clock, so I think we should actually open up to the audience, and if there are any questions you'd like to ask or further things that you'd like to add to what's been shown.
How do you see the relation between ideology, activism, a political agenda, and science itself? It's like parts of gender studies, they have this problem, to put an agenda into a scientific, result. So it tends to be biased, then more or less, if you mix it up, because because it's like a bigger impact from if a genetic code gets loose, like with GM crops. I mean, how big can the damage be? And especially you mentioned like the climate change. I mean, some of the skeptics, I mean, they have good arguments, and and the other thing is that it's easy to call them denialists or skeptics, in a way, in a negative way. I mean, the same is true for AIDS research. I mean, there's a big controversy going on too. I mean, it's held down. So this is these are all parts or facets of like Einstein found out, you can never have a scientific result without having the thinker in the result there.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I think that's the underlying question of the whole project. And I think with something that I'm really interested in is this idea of exact science, and I don't think that exists. And I think as much as we want these things to be exact or to fit, reliable systems, there is no such thing, and everything is cultural in the end. So, I mean, the GMO example is a good one because there is scientific evidence on both sides. And so you know, it's like what does a number mean, or what does, you know, it's very, very complex, and everything can be twisted to fit a certain agenda. And so I think that's what really fascinates me with, you know, working on this project, is kind of looking. I was recently reading something about the yield of GM crops, and it turns out that there are two versions of yield. So one is how many actual kernels of corn there are on the cob, on the corn cob, and the other one is the overall yield of the whole, say, like a whole field or something like that. And so just by using these two, the argument, do GMO crops bring more food, can have yes or no answers, and they both are backed up by science. So this whole idea that science is always sitting within an ideological or a political context is basically, yeah, driving the whole project. But I mean, there is no short answer to this. It's basically a massive question.
But I guess I think a lot of the work that goes on in these areas are all about dilemma. I don't think there are any solutions to, and that's one of the things about the way of creating designs that fit within. You know, design is very much about solution-driven usually, and there's this idea that you have a solution to everything. But you know, if we are in a situation where there is, you know, we've got all these dilemmas and complexities, and there isn't a yes or no answer, how do we actually begin to have any clarity at all? So, you know, how do we create designs that sit within these more sort of frameworks, you know, of dilemma? I mean, I think that's a really interesting kind of area.
I guess another word for dilemma then is trade-off, and so recognizing that everything's a trade-off, and you see this a lot with nuclear energy and the whole debate around that, and, you know, arguing that, you know, some people argue that nuclear is our greenest option right now, and that this is, you know, it's better to have nuclear power plants than coal plants. And some others argue that, you know, nuclear is dirty and we should be going for solar, and like it's all a question of, you know, the perceived benefit versus the perceived risks or the perceived negative aspect, and this is a highly subjective decision always, but it's a fascinating one to kind of watch.
But it comes down to, I think, economics. I mean, I was reading about the tiny nuclear reactors, and apparently they're supposed to be just too expensive to even begin to start working with. Any other questions? Any other thoughts or contributions? Bjorn?
Yeah, isn't that fundamentally sort of an ethical question and not a scientific or political question in a way? Those kind of questions. Sorry, just a little bit sidetracked. It's not really a question that I'm trying to ask. I liked your word techno-conservative, and it was sort of a slip a little bit, but it maybe kind of tells a little bit about what's at stake here. It's sort of the belief that technology sort of solves the problem, which is in a way a very conservative idea, you can probably argue. Compared to what you presented, maybe there's a different option, a different way of looking at those things. And maybe there's even a question in here. And the question would be, is that public engagement? So what's your stand on that? So in a way, you mentioned a couple of times poetics, in a way, that you're telling a story, and now if you read sort of a science fiction writer, the ambition is probably not to engage public with science, but to tell a story, and science is the topic. So is that what you do too? Is science the topic, or do you try to engage the public?
So yeah, I think, well, it's very interesting. I think a science fiction writer does end up having a critical viewpoint on the present. And so I think my aim through fiction is to maybe offer that critical standpoint, which is outside of the normal everyday. I'm still unsure what public engagement is. If it's making blown up models of cells so that we understand what's going on inside, then I'm definitely not doing that. But if it's offering these kind of perspectives on the stories that are being told about science and proposing other ones and maybe, you know, shaking things up a bit, then I think this could be public engagement. I don't think that's the generally accepted definition of public engagement, but maybe, I mean, hopefully it will be.
I think that's the right attitude to kind of public engagement. I mean, you know where it comes from. It's sort of what happened to sort of genetic engineering shouldn't happen to nanotechnology. So that's why a lot of people invented public engagement and using artists and other people to actually do that, to put them in the public. But I think that well, you probably can call it critical approach to science, and you engaging the public with science and the science with the public in a way, because otherwise you end up with this sort of Richard Dawkins attitude that science knows and all the people are too stupid to realize what's going on in a way. And that's probably not the right way to approach that. And I think a science fiction writer, or not even a science fiction writer, or literature in general, is sort of engaging probably the public with science or with issues probably the better word here, and but not in a way to translate it, but to look at what's at stake from a different perspective.
So less explaining and more questioning, basically, as the engagement part, I think. But I think, well, I don't know, I might be wrong, but I think what's happening out there that's being labeled public engagement is more of explaining at the moment. But hopefully, you know, we can shift that. It's interesting, actually, coming back to the techno-conservative, because, I mean, again, these things are very polarized just for the sake of the story, but it's very interesting. Recently, there is a whole hype around bringing back extinct species. I mean, you must have come across it. National Geographic is recently making its cover story. And I was struck by, because the argument is like, don't we have a moral imperative to bring these species back because we're responsible for their extinction? And so it kind of struck me as a techno-progressive solution to a bioconservative problem, because it's like, you know, this whole idea that we're morally responsible for species going extinct is like a bit weird. Anyway.
Morning. I've got questions really from the perspective of design theory and a growing move towards concepts of de-futuring, which incidentally I don't necessarily embrace. But my questions are really, why do we have to assume in this very modernist paradigm that design as a practice engages necessarily with the concept of the future, which is a fiction within itself? And the second is it inevitable, which is one of the big critiques from a lot of new design studies and sustainability theorists, that designers always end up with visualization? And is that actually a problem, necessarily, that it ends up with a visualized or aesthetic solution?
I'm not really familiar with the kind of theories or thoughts that you're mentioning, so forgive me if I'm completely off topic. I think it kind of, I mean, the de-futuring, it's the first time I hear the term, but it sounds great. And it's, I mean, for me, it doesn't really matter if it's, I mean, obviously the future tends to be about this techno muscle flexing of like selling the dream, right? And I think one of the challenges, or at least it's something that I think about a lot, is to steer clear of that and to kind of embed things in more of an alternative present, or something that's not necessarily a future kind of scenario. But I think in a lot of venues, the kind of work that sits in that space is called design fiction. And my main problem with that is that it kind of assumes the existence of a design non-fiction, so something that would be serious, proper, real design. And I guess what I'm interested in is to realize that, or to recognize that it's all fiction. You know, there is no such thing as like a really serious design for a washing machine. It's, you know, these you know, I think some juicers are a lot more futuristic than any design fiction in many ways, and kind of play a much bigger role in selling that dream. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but...
The second question was about Alison, about the visualization, or whether designers end up just being visualizers. I think it's one of the greatest powers designers have, is having this capability of putting things in context and making them graspable, like your knitted body germ suit. That's why people react to it. So if we want to engage, whatever that means, a greater public, or a little bit greater public, it is about doing that. So I don't think that's a negative at all. It's like that's really cool and fun, and should be embraced. And by giving these possible answers, new questions arise. Actually,
I completely agree with that. The one aspect of visualization that is coming up more and more recently, is as a graphic design background that I am, is the kind of data porn trend, and this idea that just because you have a graph or statistics, and we're getting more and more statistics from our phones and everything, that there is necessarily meaning in that. And so, I don't know, for me it's about finding ways to tell the story differently, I guess.
Yeah, that was a great, for me it's in these visualizations, also in a crocheted, but also in a visible membrane, it's this, informing about the invisible facts which are actually there, and as I already said before, like to make them touchable and tangible, and yeah, that's
Yeah, it's a question to you, Professor Revi. It's about the title. I'm curious about the title. You call it Real Fiction, the lecture series, and I wonder about the word real. Do you mean reality fiction, or do you mean like hardcore fiction? What is the meaning of real?
Okay. I guess that's the whole point of it being quite ambiguous, in that it is supposed to look at the boundaries between what we perceive, how far do we go with reality? Do we see as, what do we really see as real, and how do we? And I think that changes. In fact, we're about to do at the Design Museum next week in London a kind of gathering of a group of specialists with a project we're doing with political scientists, an economist, I think there's an ethicist, and a bioscientist. And I think in some ways one of the questions we want to ask them is, where are the edges of their reality, and where do they think that, where is real for them and where is fictional for them? Because I think even within the domain of design, we're still sort of playing with what kinds of reality. So I thought that was quite interesting between the two projects, because in some ways you could say that is Sonja's project more real because she goes into a lab and plays with the bacteria, or is David's project more real because he deals with some political, very kind of large political ideas of things that are really kind of happening in the world, and I don't think there's a straightforward answer to who depends on whose reality you're speaking with. So in fact, in this whole series, in some ways, we're going to have Bruce Sterling here, who's a science fiction writer, coming as well, and I think that is sort of an area that I think is ripe and interesting for design to operate within this world. And I think one of the ideas we're trying in our own work to look at is the aesthetics of the unreal. How do you actually, and in fact it's actually Kobe who's going to come next week to speak. He's dealing with a very, very interesting space where all of the things that he's doing are a story, and yet each of the products that his projects is based on are real services that exist on the internet that you can upload and download. I won't spoil next week's presentation, but it really challenges the idea of is that real? The fact that he can access these services to create something that isn't real. So again, I think this is again what this exploration is about. So I probably haven't answered your question very well, but I think in some ways that's what this is very much about. And as designers, can we develop an aesthetic that sort of positions the unreal such that we can then use it and to understand and interrogate things in ways that we wouldn't normally be able to do. So for example, the safe space that David's not creating, because maybe his visions are too realistic and we're almost threatened by them. But if they were too fantastical and if they were on a TV, then maybe, you know, a TV, we think, well, that's fiction, maybe I don't have to deal with that anymore. So it's this constant, difficult balance between what we'll accept, the plausibility, you know, as to what we accept as being real. But maybe that's where we should finish tonight. But I'd like to thank very much our two speakers, David and Sonja.